This is the Wheaton High School cell tower. This tower is very close to the school, and the school is very close to where I grew up. I'm in Montgomery County, Maryland. We have several cell towers at schools. Today, I'm going to be talking about safety issues, financial issues, and the radiation, yes, but also all of the other things that people need to know when they hear that a cell tower is coming into their community. I came into this issue about 15 years ago, and at the time, I really could not believe that there could possibly be any issue with wireless, my beloved cell phone. The more I learned, the more I got involved, and I've ended up shifting my entire career in order to work on this issue. So I'm going to be talking about everything from the radiation issues, the physical risks, fire, cell tower collapse, hazardous materials, environmental impacts, outdated policy, our 1996 limits, our lack of measuring and monitoring, and also the financial impacts like reduced property value, loss of homeowner equity, really the minimal amount that schools are getting for leases, administrative costs that are not covered when a cell tower comes into a community, especially a school. I am going to be focusing on schools and cell towers near homes, and also the liability and risk issues that come with cell towers. They are classified as high risk by the insurance companies, which, as standard, don't insure for the RF radiation health damages.
Did you know the insurance industry will not underwrite companies building out the 5G infrastructure? 5G is deemed as an emerging risk, as the biological effects of EMF in general and 5G in particular are still being debated. Potential claims for health impairments may come with a long latency. That's from Sonar's 2019 Swiss Re Zurich, Switzerland Reinsurance Company report. Final thing I'll mention before I go, 10K disclosure. Crown Castle International out of Houston, Texas is a publicly shared company. They have a 10K disclosure they have to give to shareholders. In that 10K disclosure, it reads, if frequency emissions from wireless handsets or equipment on our communications infrastructure are demonstrated to cause negative health effects, potential future claims could adversely affect our operations, costs, or revenues. We currently do not maintain any significant insurance with respect to these matters. They have to let their shareholders know. I thank you for your time, and I encourage you, please, to take into consideration that right now in the United States, there are 418,000 cell towers. Over the next 6 years, that will go up another 800,000, a 300% increase. This is only just beginning.
So I'm going to be talking about all of that and more. This is the Grandview High School in Ohio that has 3 cell towers at the stadium. Cell towers are increasingly being placed where we live, work, play. We're seeing them not just on school grounds, but on playgrounds, in residential neighborhoods. And the decisions are often fast-tracked without public notice, and critical information is being left out of the conversation. Now we have federal bills moving forward, which are going to further fast-track cell towers as if it were even possible, but indeed it is. This is an unprecedented time. So it's very important that everyone interested in this issue learn everything you can about the issue so you can educate your community, educate your family and friends, talk to your elected officials so that we can move this issue to where it needs to go, which is responsible and thoughtful telecommunications policy. This is an image of a tower sent to me by a person who asked, is this safe? The other image is from when I was in San Francisco visiting. This was right outside my window. I took this picture. These are very close proximity cell towers. So I'm going to be talking about macro cell towers. Those are the tall cell towers that you think of when you hear the word cell towers. But there are also 5G, 4G, quote unquote, small cells, which are really not small in many ways, but they are shorter cell towers with less antennas on them. And they also emit RF radiation.
And then there are building mounted wireless antenna sites. That's when you have cellular antennas, the same types as you would see on a cell tower, but they're not on a tall pole. Instead, they're mounted on buildings, rooftops, or another tall structure. There can be one or two antennas or numerous antennas, just as you would see on a macro tall cell tower, and they all transmit RF radiation. This is an apartment building near my mother's house, and that is not a mushroom. Those are cellular antennas that are covered up by pretend bricks. Now, these antennas might look small when you're standing on the ground, but they're actually several feet high. This is industrial machinery, and it brings numerous health and safety risks.
So let's start with fire. Cell towers and 5G equipment, they pose documented fire risks. Cell equipment can catch fire. It can ignite the vegetation on the ground as well. In some cases, school sports fields had to be closed because of fires. This has happened at multiple schools, and we have this online at Environmental Health Sciences on our cell towers page. We have links to the cell tower light pole that caught fire at Otay Ranch High School Stadium in California and then toppled down.
On to a scary moment now in the South Bay tonight when a light pole with an attached cell phone tower caught fire. Our Phil Blauer is here now with those details.
Yeah, Kathleen, this is very dramatic video. Take a look at this. Happened about 7:30 at the Otay Ranch High School Stadium. Chula Vista fire officials say the tower collapsed onto the bleachers and rubberized track, causing extensive damage, but fortunately no injuries. Crews had to wait for SDG&E to get out there and turn off the power that was feeding that tower. Once that happened, the fire was finally put out. Investigators right now are still trying to determine what caused this collapse.
Heritage High School in Virginia, Thurston High in Oregon, Grandview Heights High in Ohio. And this image that you're seeing is Thurston High, where the news reports say that the cell phone tower caught fire. It sent a plume of smoke high above the Colts sports field. The fire destroyed some of the shrubbery near the athletic fields, but officials said it won't delay classes. Thankfully, there weren't any children or teachers or staff on the field at the time. It's important to, when cell towers are proposed, to think about, especially on schools, the fall zone. Cell towers can collapse during high winds, storms, or structural failure can happen where parts of them can come down. There can be ice accumulation that can fall. Ice strikes, and
they just reopened it here a short time ago. The concern about ice falling off of that huge TV tower there you see behind me, the high winds this morning and yesterday dropping that ice to the ground below. And take a look at the pieces of ice this size, an inch thick. You can imagine what that would do if it hit somebody.
It is endangering citizens here. Cars apparently were hit. I don't want to be hit standing out here with you now, but it could be very dangerous for people.
Lois Weisner has seen it before. She says this is the first time Shorewood closed Wilson Drive, though, for a couple of blocks because of the danger.
It was kind of scary because it just came down in big chunks.
One of those chunks sailed into an apartment window, damaging the shutter and smashing the glass.
We have links to all of this at EH Sciences, where you can see examples of ice falling down off the structure. There's also hardware, pieces of equipment that can fall off towers. And of course, if it's on fire, burning pieces can fall down, things can get dislodged over storms and then fall down later and so forth. So everything within a cell tower's fall zone is at risk. And that is why setbacks are a basic public safety measure. When communities have banned cell towers at schools, sometimes this is one of the most important things. Why would we put an industrial piece of equipment near a school where there's children, students, teachers, staff that could be in the fall zone? There are often chain link fences around these or some kind of barriers around the tower, but just within, 10, 20, 30 feet, if that. And kids like to climb. They do climb. And there are examples of that as well that are on our website of people who climb on towers. When cell towers are placed on schools, on school property, on athletic fields, near homes and playgrounds, children and residents are placed inside the fall zone. There are also hazardous materials which are on cell sites. And this is a really important question to ask when a cell tower is proposed near home or school, which is what is the power supply? What is the backup power supply? So there will often be diesel fuel tanks for the backup generators. Those have to be maintenance. They have to run some of it off. They normally have a schedule, which is once a month or twice a month. It's important to find that out, what the schedule is, because then they'll burn off some of the diesel fuel. There are batteries, lead acid, lithium ion backup batteries, and other kinds actually. Fuel spills and groundwater contamination are documented. Sites in my county, in Montgomery County, they are considered hazmat sites. Why? Because first responders need to know that there are toxic materials on site if there's a fire because of the toxic smoke that can be released, and the need to care for the hazardous materials on site. Another issue is that there are herbicides and chemicals that are often sprayed for weeds. I'll also note that a lot of times companies don't care for the property once it's gone up. There isn't anyone checking. I mean, the teachers and staff at schools are doing their job, educating the kids, not checking if the cell tower company is properly maintaining the grounds. And that is like a whole issue, is the oversight related to the care of the compound. We've had these issues in our county at Daly Elementary and in communities, I'm sure, across the nation where it's left unkempt and things are growing all around it. And it's yet another issue with these facilities. Just a few weeks ago, the news was released that Verizon Wireless agreed to pay $7.7 million to settle a civil enforcement case in California after state and local prosecutors found Verizon had violated environmental and hazardous material laws at thousands of cell tower sites statewide. And I'll just quote the West Side Today article, which said, many of these sites store hazardous substances that can pose safety and environmental risks if not managed correctly, including the potential for fires, explosions, and the release of toxic air contaminants. There's not much oversight. I mean, I'm glad to see what's happening in California, but this is an issue nationwide in terms of the lack of oversight related to the environmental impacts. And I'm not just talking about the RF radiation, but all of these other issues related to these sites, because there's really no one checking. As I'm going to talk about, there isn't a federal agency that's going around and checking our cell tower sites to see that everything is properly done. Now, local communities can have some kind of oversight mechanism in place, but oftentimes they don't. They're not necessarily aware of it. You know, cell tower issues are quite complicated and complex. I hope that in time, especially with these federal bills, that people are going to start looking into this, looking into the environmental issues, the oversight. You know, how does my community handle the issue of cell towers? Ask yourself that question, like, who's in charge? How are they permitted? What's the application process like? How are decisions made? All of these process issues are very important, as are the compliance and oversight pieces related to the environment or RF radiation. When a cell tower is proposed, people come together with all kinds of different issues, everything from the radiation to the property value to the financial impacts to the lack of process, just not being notified, and so forth. So let's talk about property values. Cell towers drop property values, and their estimates, I just found this letter going all the way up to 30%. There are also published reports by real estate professionals and analysts that find the property values of nearby homes situated near cell towers are at risk of being devalued 5 to 20%. Realtors consistently report that buyers are reluctant to purchase homes near visible cell towers. If you have a cell tower within the view, like if I saw a cell tower when I was looking for homes, I would look elsewhere, because if I could choose one with a tower or without a tower, which would I choose? Especially when I had children living in my home. There's also a loss of homeowner equity without consent or compensation. And that in turn can reduce local tax revenue, affecting schools and municipalities. A lot of testimony you may hear when there's a cell tower proposed speaks to that. So, are we really saving money by putting the cell tower at the school? Is this really helping our community, especially when, frankly, the leases are so low? Now, small cells also have been documented to impact property values. So here is a picture sent to me by a family in San Mateo. There are the cell antennas right outside the children's bedroom window. Back in 2018, 2019, the FCC was moving forward to fast track 5G and 4G small cells, quote unquote, the 30 feet and lower cell towers. I'm sure some of you on the call remember this time. It's hard to forget it. So at the time, Montgomery County and also several other communities got together and did filings. There was lawsuits against the federal government. Amidst all of that, there were a lot of filings that are extremely useful to read and be aware of. So one of them was by the Smart Communities and Special Districts Coalition, which submitted on the impacts to the community from this fast tracking of 5G and small cells. And in there is a report and declaration by David Bourguignon. I apologize if I did not say that correctly, but that was a real estate appraiser for the Smart Cities Coalition. And there's a report in there about the reduction in value for homes where there are facilities in close proximity. It says, while the magnitude of the impact varies, he says, the studies uniformly indicate that there is a significant impact on residential property values from installation of cell towers. Not surprisingly, the studies that show little or no impact are universally commissioned by and paid for by the telecommunications industry. They also note that these installations can be bulky, inconsistent, and even noisy. That's also an issue with cell towers. They can have a buzz nearby from the machinery. And we have all of that online for you to download. People with more financial resources can more easily move away from the cell antennas. We have at EH Sciences a page on this on cell towers drop property value. You can download these resources. Everything is hyperlinked. And it also has letters from realtors that we have collected, that I've collected over the years related to property value decreases from cell towers. Companies will often go to schools and say, well, you're going to get some money if we can just lease this amount of land. But it's really not a lot of money that they're getting. This is the Fayetteville, Arizona school cell tower. Recently, it was in the news this year. The lease is $1,000 a month plus $300 more for each carrier. Pole can accommodate 4 carriers. This is not a lot of money for a school district. It does not count the administrative costs for managing the lease. So, for example, in Montgomery County, there's actually staff whose job it is to manage leases. This is time, this is money. That's what this is. Not counted for in that little monthly lease amount. And some superintendents have said, we realize this isn't a lot of money, because it is not. So is it worth it? Is the question that communities need to ask themselves. I think the answer is no. There's also innumerable resources spent addressing parent and community concerns. Is that worth it? The other issue is renovation and construction conflicts. And that is how we ended up here with this cell tower right near the Wheaton High School. So this school building was originally set back from the tower, but then they decided to renovate, only they had this cell tower that was on the property. Districts sign leases that some of them are 30 years. That's a long time, 10, 30 years. By the time, there might be more and more antennas added on, the parents, the administration who are involved making that decision are not there for the lifetime of that lease. This is a really important issue. So it doesn't allow for community consent because the decision happened well before the people that are living or working with that tower or schooling with that tower were on site.
Yeah, well, as you know, as a Montgomery County parent, there's lots of construction, and Wheaton is one of the schools that is under construction right now, Wheaton High School. The school has had a cell phone tower on the campus for quite some time. However, with this big construction project going on, there have been changes that put the tower right next to the school. If you look closely, you can see that previously, here's a photograph, the tower was actually on the football field. Now, it's not that it's that the building moved, not the tower. Now this group called Safe Schools has released a video that claims the radiation levels coming from the tower are unsafe.
Their renovation project was around the tower rather than being designed fully for what is best for the school. And there are actually numerous examples of that. This is the Green Bay West High School Stadium in Wisconsin. So the school wanted to renovate their stadium. They had a tower, they wanted to renovate. They had a $9 million renovation planned. But that cell tower was exactly where they wanted the bleachers to go. There were a lot of news stories where they talked about, well, should we move it? If we did, it would be $1 million. What do we do? And a lot of news stories on that. So ultimately, they decided on a compromise, and that was that the school district would pay $130,000 in construction costs to shift the tower's ground equipment under the bleachers, not necessarily safe, but that's what they did, while the city renegotiated its lease. And because of the loss of $155,000, the school district partially offset that by providing an additional $100,000 upfront payment. This is Bennett Elementary in Detroit, Michigan, where there are parents that got involved on this when they realized that was a cell tower, because they didn't know. They hadn't really looked up or thought about it. And a parent realized what was going on and started talking about it. And then in the school board meetings, they began to have many conversations and realized that there were lots of cell towers on their schools. This is one of many. They have these smokestacks, and the antennas are fixated on them all across Detroit, Michigan schools. Last I know, they were not able to get these towers down. They had signed leases. I had 3 presentations at the American Public Health Association, 2 posters, where I presented in the poster on how distancing cell towers from schools is primary prevention. Because of the RF radiation, the recommendations to reduce exposure, and the fact that many governments around the world have reduced exposure by keeping those antennas away from schools at a distance or simply banned from schools. And you can go online to Environmental Health Sciences to see the poster, to read it. I have everything hyperlinked and cited and referenced. So let's talk about the radiation. Me coming on to this 15 years ago, I was floored to read so many scientific statements, published papers, where the recommendation was to minimize exposure, not to increase it. Cell tower radiation is not natural. It is not a natural form of electromagnetic fields that we evolved under. It's not the same as the sun or the Earth's magnetic field. It is man-made, artificial, pulsed, modulated. These are complex signals where there's information being carried on the waves. And there are thousands of studies, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, that have documented biological effects at levels that our limits, which are set sky high, would consider very low.
I've spent over 40 years in the technology industry. My most recent position was president of Microsoft Canada, and I've seen the tremendous benefit technology can provide. I've also seen the potential harm if technology is not used correctly. In my opinion, our current implementation of wireless technology is not safe. I've met with experts from institutions such as Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and the University of Toronto, and I've met with an expert advisor to the World Health Organization and one of the lead scientific writers for Al Gore's team that won the Nobel Prize. Over 250 scientists from 40 countries signed a formal appeal to the World Health Organization and the United Nations member states expressing their concern over the harmful effects of wireless technology, and added an additional appeal for the effects of 5G, especially the effects on children. Hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers have been published demonstrating harm to humans and the environment. This evidence includes increase in cancer, sperm damage, reproductive harms, memory and learning deficits, especially in children, and damage to our DNA, nervous systems, and the cells in our bodies.
I'm Dr. Cindy Russell, Executive Director for Physicians for Safe Technology, and I have no financial interest in this matter. I'm here to discuss with you the health effects of cell towers. I'm a Stanford-trained physician that studied environmental toxins through our local county medical association and the California Medical Association for over 25 years. I've worked on pesticides, flame retardants, bisphenol A, fracking chemicals, and other toxins. Most currently, I've been working on wireless technology. Physicians are increasingly concerned about the health effects of this technology, and in the last 2 years, I've spoken at 3 physician conferences for continuing medical education on the health effects of wireless technology. I became interested in this topic when I learned of a proposal to place a cell tower in my daughter's school over 10 years ago, and I dove into the research. And what I learned is that 7 decades of military and scientific study indicates that wireless technology is not only biologically active, it acts as an environmental and human toxicant. The mechanism of toxicity of wireless frequencies is the same as that of many chemical toxins we're exposed to. It causes oxidative stress. It causes injury to DNA, lipids, proteins, nerve cells, heart cells, the immune system, the reproductive system, and the nervous system. Health effects can be evident acutely or after long-term exposures. Acute effects occur soon after exposure and include neurologic symptoms such as headaches, nausea, dizziness, irritability, memory loss, heart palpitations, insomnia, and fatigue. Firefighters have these same symptoms when cell towers were placed near their fire stations. Thus, the International Association of Firefighters developed a policy resolution to prevent placement of cell towers on fire stations due to health effects. This is now law and codified in 2 California telecom bills, AB 57 and AB 537. I'm working with a town back east fighting a cell tower placed without proper notification. When the cell tower was turned on, 17 people lived in the neighborhood near the cell tower. They had the same neurologic symptoms as the firefighters. People are now moving out and considering selling their homes if they can. Long-term effects occur over time as the biologic damage is cumulative. These effects include cancer, reproductive failure, including miscarriage, damage to the nervous system with ADHD, cognitive decline, and memory impairment. Wildlife and insects are even more sensitive than we are and also adversely affected by cell towers. 8 out of 10 studies showed that neurobehavioral symptoms or cancer developed in populations living at distances less than 500 meters from cell tower base stations. Dodd in 2011 published a 10-year study by the Department of Health in the 3rd largest city in Brazil and showed that within 1,600 feet of a cell tower, the rate of cancer increased by up to 17-fold, and those power density readings were within the FCC guidelines. Egger looked at a town in Bavaria and published his findings that showed a 3-fold increase in malignancies if you lived just 5 years near a cell tower that was within 400 meters or about 1,200 feet. Mayo in 2018 published his research examining the neurologic functioning of students in 2 schools that had an adjacent cell tower. One tower had 5 times higher power density, but all within the FCC guidelines, and he showed significant cognitive decline in the students near the high-powered cell tower after 2 years. Pierce in 2020 has provided the most recent assessment and promotes a 500-meter setback to limit future liabilities for telecom companies. Insurance companies all have exclusions for coverage for adverse health effects of radiofrequency radiation. They consider it similar to asbestos. It's a high risk. I encourage you to have a strong ordinance with setbacks and protections for the health and well-being of your community. Thank you.
Children are understood to be more vulnerable. There are a lot of scientific papers that have looked at children and adults and how RF radiation is absorbed into their bodies from a phone or from a Wi-Fi device. This is from the CWIN project. This is an EU Commission-funded report where they looked at exposures into people in various positions. But this image was really striking to me because it really exemplifies how children are more exposed from a far field, meaning a source that is far away from you rather than close. So when there's something really far away, it's full body exposure. And what this was showing was the rate of absorption of RF radiation, which is emitted by cell towers, into a child, man and woman. Yellow is the highest levels, and blue is the lowest. So it goes from yellow to orange to red, purple, blue. And you can see more of the child's body is yellow. They are more exposed. We know that because they have smaller heads, thinner skulls, more conductive brain tissue, they have significantly higher absorption into their bodies of RF radiation. And studies on cell phones have found twice the amount into the cerebellum, that's a region in the brain, 10 times into the bone marrow, and over 30 times into the hippocampus compared to adults. There are a lot of studies that have looked at the increases or the exposures from wireless radiation emitted from, be it small 4G, 5G antennas, small cells, or macro towers. There is a series by Dr. Leonard Hardell, Tarmer Koppel, that looks at measurements from 5G antennas. And they have this image there, which I think is useful so you can sort of visualize what's going on. So you have the pole, the antenna on top of the pole, and then it is often aimed, and they're all angled at different angles, generally down, but not all the way down. They'll kind of go out depending on what their area they're servicing. But you can see with the red how the more intense areas are the darker ones. When you have a macro tower, so a tall cell tower, the highest intensity from the beam of that antenna can actually be at anywhere from 200 to 300 feet or more or less. It really depends on the antenna, the way it's angled, all kinds of technical issues, but it's not necessarily right at the bottom of the facility, although there are side lobes, of course. I want to make sure that you're aware of a few key research studies. Alfonso Balmori did a review of cell phone tower antennas, looking at research on people that lived near cell towers, and found that the majority of studies reported impacts. And he identified 3 buckets for what those impacts were: cancer, radiofrequency sickness, so that's the constellation of health impacts that people report near cell towers: dizziness, headaches, neurological issues, sleep problems, hormonal issues, and also altered biochemical markers, because there are studies where they have actually taken the blood of people and looked, at them to see any changes compared to people who live further away from cell antennas. The American Academy of Pediatrics has long recommended that children be better protected and that there be an update to our regulations to better protect children and during pregnancy as well, and also the real-world use of devices in our current exposures, which are cumulative. This is off the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics webpage on electromagnetic fields, a hazard to your health. that has a section on cell towers and talks about, well, one study in particular, an Egyptian study that found living near mobile phone base stations. That is what you'll hear, mobile phone base station or cell tower. Mobile phone base station is what cell towers are called in Europe and many other countries. In the US, we call them cell towers generally. And that they increase the risk for developing, in this study, headaches, memory problems, dizziness, depression, sleep problems. And then it says, short-term exposure to these fields in experimental studies have not always shown negative effects, but this does not rule out cumulative damage from these fields. So larger studies over longer periods are needed to help understand who is at risk. Oh, and then it says, in large studies, an association has been observed between symptoms and exposure to these fields in the everyday environment. This page has been up for many years. It needs to be updated, but this was well before Alfonso Bamori's piece, and actually a lot of other studies that have been published looking at the issue. The European Parliament Study Service asked for a study on 5G. This, you can go online to find it. It's the European Parliament Health Impact of 5G report. And it had conclusions about the radio frequencies that are commonly, have long been used for the last few decades since telecommunications began. These are the low and low midband. And they conclude that there is evidence for cancer. They say it is probably carcinogenic for humans, in particular related to gliomas and acoustic neuromas. Those are tumors that they found to be associated with people that use cell phones long-term close to their heads. There's also a large-scale animal study that was done in Italy that found increased tumors in the male rats at levels that would be considered compliant with FCC limits for what cell towers are allowed to emit here in the US. And those tumors were the same kinds as were found in the National Toxicology Program, US National Toxicology Program studies of rats, male rats, that were exposed to higher levels to mimic a cell phone, what the levels would be if you held a cell phone close to your head.
The Ramazzini Institute in Italy just released a study, it says, shows lab animals exposed to environmental levels of cell tower radiation can develop cancer. The Institute's study used exposures below the FCC limits, and its results mimic a $25 million study of much higher levels of cell phone radio frequency radiation from the U.S. National Toxicology Program.
We have had in the past a lot of wrong attitude, ignoring or discarding or discrediting good results. It is no more the time to do that.
There also are reproductive developmental effects. These, and I'm just quoting what it says, these frequencies clearly affect male fertility and possibly female fertility too. They may have possible adverse effects on the development of embryos, fetuses, and newborns. The majority of studies on wireless radiation have reported effects on key health-related endpoints. So if you go to Dr. Joel Moskowitz's website at saferemr.org, a really great place to see the research and a lot of the history of this issue. Dr. Henry Lai, every couple months, will compile the research. He looks at what found effects, what didn't find effects for these various endpoints for oxidative stress, which can contribute to all kinds of chronic diseases. 89% since 1997 of the studies that have been performed that he reviewed found an effect versus no effect. Genetic impacts, 71%. Neurological impacts, 77%. Reproduction and development, 84%. It's often said that, well, the consensus is that cell tower radiation is safe. But in fact, that is absolutely 100% not true, because there are hundreds of scientists and medical doctors, in fact, thousands, that are calling for reducing exposure and taking steps to mitigate risk not to increase exposure. This is the EMF scientist appeal signed by over 250 scientists from 44 nations who've published in the field of non-ionizing electromagnetic field radiation. You can go online to read the EMF scientist appeal. I'm going to quote from their appeal to the United Nations, to the World Health Organization, to address this issue. They talk about the effects, which include increased cancer risk, cellular stress, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damages, structural and functional changes of the reproductive system, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on general well-being in humans. And there are also many appeals where entire groups of doctors have signed on. We have that on our website at Environmental Health Sciences. We also have more published research on cell towers and health if you're interested. Everything is hyperlinked, so I try to keep it up to date. You can click on the name of the author, get to the published study or to the online link to read the whole thing. So please go to our website to learn more. A lot of times in meetings, and I have been in, I would safely say, hundreds of cell tower meetings at this point, where the wireless company will come out and say, if you're using a cell phone, you shouldn't be worried about this because, this is much less radiation than a cell phone. Well, in fact, young children are not using cell phones. And it's a really important question. Well, how much radiation are we getting when we're near a tower? So there have been a couple studies on this, and I want to highlight the study on kindergartens in Australia. They looked at several kindergartens. They looked at ones that had telecommunications antenna facility, wireless antennas within 300 meters, and those that had installations further away. And they found a nearly 3.5 times higher radiation exposure to the children who had antennas in close proximity. There was also a more recent publication by Dr. Hardell and Nilsson on RF radiation near schools in Sweden, and they found elevated levels from nearby 4G and 5G wireless network base stations. And they talk about how those levels are above the levels where experts have recommended that the limits be, because there are recommendations that have been made to mitigate levels down based on what the research has shown in terms of long-term effects, low intensity biological effects. And they found that a lot of those levels were much higher than what they found at the schools. And they say these levels may cause increased risks of both short-term and long-term negative effects on children's health. There's also a very important summary of 7 case reports that Hardell and Nilsson did on 5G facilities near people's schools, homes, and workplace, and found increased symptoms such as, just like Alfonso Bomori documented, headaches, dizziness, sleep problems, memory problems, and so forth.
I am here to talk about the cell antennas in my front yard. I can no longer sleep in my own room because of it. Please move the cell antennas so our lives can go back to normal again. Thank you.
Thanks. To my little girls, I'm a little choked up. In late December, Verizon installed a very powerful cell antenna right outside my daughter's window. About a month after the antenna was installed, both of my daughters came down with cold and flu-like symptoms. Another month passed and my daughters were still ill. We began to wonder if the recently installed antennas could be affecting their health. My brother Noah, who is a scientist in the family, began researching the safety of cell antennas and the radiation that they emit. He found hundreds of studies and experts warning about the dangers of wireless radiation, including immune system suppression, which I believe my daughters have suffered, and cancer, one of the diseases we all fear the most. He's also found that guidelines designed to protect us from this wireless radiation are based on the outdated assumption that the only biological effect caused by wireless radiation is heating.
Because I was injured and my little sister was injured due to a cell tower being placed in my neighborhood. If you have followed the news, 14 of our neighbors have been harmed and 3 have cancer. We never knew this would become a living nightmare with people's cancer returning, people having to leave their homes, and worse, people becoming homeless.
This study talks about how children's brains absorb more cell tower radiation than adults. This is a 2023 study. It's published in Environmental Research, and they found that continuous 24-hour radiation from cell towers, from base stations, can lead to over 10 times greater daily RF radiation exposure into a 6-year-old child's brain compared to their typical cell phone use. And what they did was they actually used real-world measurements and computer simulations to investigate this issue, because it is a question, right? Think about, how much are we getting from a cell tower? Remember, it's daily, continuous, full body. You can't turn it off. So what they found is that while cell phone use can create short exposures of high intensity, the constant low-level exposure from nearby cell towers can contribute far more to a child's total RFR dose over 24 hours. This is one of the images from the study where they looked at the numbers as well as computer simulations of the rate into the brain. Here they looked at the specific absorption rate, which is the rate that the RF radiation is absorbed into an amount of tissue, which is a whole issue to talk about at another time. It is in my paper, but looking at the rate, they found that a child's smaller head and thinner skulls resulted in higher localized absorption of the RF energy, indicating that younger brains at any one moment in time will take in more radiation under the same exposure conditions as compared to an adult. The blue is the 6-year-old child, the gray is the adult. Then they looked at the total energy absorbed by the brain over time, over 24 hours. So this is not SAR. They found that over a full day, children accumulate substantially more total brain radiation than adults. And continuous exposure from the cell tower far exceeded the dose they got from their brief cell phone use. This exposure is continuous and involuntary, so it might be low, but it builds up over time. The other thing we aren't told when a cell tower comes to our school is that the RF levels can increase every year. Now, industry will say it's not increasing, and they often will share studies that they've done, but those studies have not looked at the total level of exposure. Very often it's certain frequency ranges, not all the frequency ranges, or maybe they only looked at one thing and not the other. Then there are studies where a school district, so as an example, these aren't published, but this is information I got from the Fairfax, Virginia school cell tower situation. There they have several schools with cell towers. Now, because parents got organized on it, they actually had it so that the company needs to do an RF report every year, or actually it's a little unclear because right now I've only gotten some of my Freedom of Information request reports, and they're not for every single year. But there are a lot of reports that have been done on the RF radiation in the school area over several years. Some of those cell towers were put a decade ago. I was able to get through my Freedom of Information requests, the 2019 studies, as well as the 2021 RF reports. And what I did was I looked at what were the levels in 2019 and what were the levels in 2021. Not all, but many of them, the majority of them, had increases over time. So one middle school, Thoreau Middle School, rose from 0.36% of FCC limits to 14.87. These are the highest levels that they measured in 2021. That's a 40-fold increase. Centerville High from 0.36% in 2019 to 2.97% in 2021. That's an 8-fold increase. I have a lot of these on our website. Now, you might hear, oh, 0.36%, that's not high. What should I be even worried about that? But the levels that we have in terms of the limits that we have are completely outdated. I'm going to be talking about this. They are sky high because effects have been found 100, 1,000 or more times lower than these limits. As I'll talk about, the limits are set to protect for burns, for overheating, not effects of overheating. They are not designed to protect for long-term impacts. Oftentimes when a cell tower is proposed, there'll just be one carrier that is being proposed, and they'll do a simulation and say, okay, it's going to be like, 1%. Well, what they don't tell you is that there can be more antennas that are added onto that facility. Like here you have 1, 2, 3, 4. And that over time, usage patterns can change and the levels can increase. Now, I also pose the question in my American Public Health Association poster, whether cell towers were disproportionately located at schools that serve low-income families. And I used my town of Montgomery County to perform an analysis. So what I looked at was the high schools that had cell towers and the high schools that didn't have cell towers in Montgomery County. I also looked at the FARMS rates. FARMS rates are the rates of free and reduced priced meals. I used information from 2022. That was the most recent information I had. And I found, I should mention, there are 11 schools at Montgomery County that have cell towers. 10 are high schools. 1 is an elementary school. They now say that they will not put cell towers at elementary schools here in the county. On average, the 10 high schools with cell towers had FARMS rates of 51.88%, while the 15 schools without towers had a lower average of 30.69%. This disparity suggests a pattern of inequity linked to socioeconomic status within a district as to how cell towers are placed. In one situation, in a very affluent area of the county, within 24 hours, that cell tower was stopped when the parents stood up and said something. Whereas in another community, they fought and fought and fought. And in fact, the room was filled with people saying they didn't want, parents, mostly parents, saying they didn't want this cell tower. And yet it wasn't stopped until the community just went all out, in all the ways that people who work on cell tower issues trying to get more thoughtful placement do.
These towers are put predominantly on the east side of the county, not the west side of the county. Darlene was very smart to ask, where are these at? What schools? What schools have said no? You know the schools they're saying no? The schools in Potomac. Wooten said no. Wooten had a very big meeting and said no. And you know what they did? They walked away because they didn't want to fight the parents. And so we got very angry because we're in a form school, predominantly African American, predominantly Latino, and they want to put this tower here. They came here without giving us any notice in November because they didn't think we cared. They didn't think you would show up. They didn't think you would advocate. So I'm telling you that we have to stand.
Notice is so important with these facilities. This is an example of a small cell in Langley Park near an apartment building. People can't easily move. I want to draw your attention to the other poster I did at the American Public Health Association conference. It was on the need for an occupational health program to ensure oversight for RF and also low frequency, non-ionizing electromagnetic fields. So you can go to the website to learn more about that. That's another issue I'm very passionate about: children, wildlife, workers, because the modern workplace is filled with RF radiation from the towers, all the things inside, and there isn't any measuring, monitoring, or risk mitigation for that exposure. So this is showing how the US government and countries that follow ICNIRP have among the highest levels. They allow the highest levels of radio frequency radiation from cell towers compared to many other countries worldwide. So you have India, which, by the way, used to have even much more stringent levels with 4G, but now with 5G, they have loosened their limits because of industry pressure. Croatia, Israel, Italy, which unfortunately Italy and Belgium also, regions in Belgium, also loosened their previously very strict limits because of industry pressure, yet they are still stricter than the United States. China and Russia have much more stringent limits. Why? Because they have had active research programs since the Cold War, before that, actually, working on this issue related to military use as well as therapeutic uses, and they have set more stringent limits. Now, importantly, their limits do not necessarily mean safety, because there have been effects found at levels even lower than the limits of these countries that have more stringent limits. Yet, what this really reflects is how the US government is not leading the way in safety. We do not have researchers looking at this issue in the US government in any robust way, at least that I know of at this time, though there may be some movement on that coming up. There was this moment in understanding this issue when I learned about how the limits were set that changed everything for me. So here we have a little mouse. The way our limits were set were based on small mice, rats, small monkeys that were exposed to wireless radiation, microwaves, for a very short amount of time, under an hour. They had been previously trained to press a lever for food. They were exposed in under an hour, and the level at which they stopped pressing the lever for food, that is the level at which the engineers who were doing the research decided that's bad. Like, something's going on. This is a behavioral impact. We know it's harming them. They had the temperature measured of the animals, and that overheating level is considered the level of adverse effect that our limits are based on.
I first want to go into the basis for the exposures, that limits that have been established by the ICNIRP and the FCC. These go back to studies that were conducted in monkeys by the Navy, U.S. Navy Department in the 1980s. And what the studies were based on were rats and monkeys that were trained to push a lever to obtain food. And after they were trained, they were exposed to radio frequency radiation at different frequencies and power levels. And what was reported was that at approximately a specific absorption rate, this is a measure of the internal absorption of the energy, that at that level of 4 watts per kilogram and higher, the response rates were decreased. This occurred in rats and in monkeys as well. And with monkeys, in addition, there was a 1 degree rise in their body temperature. So a few things about this. One is The number of animals that were studied in these particular groups was very small. There were 8 rats and 5 monkeys. And this is the basis for the exposure limits that are being used throughout the world. The studies were 40-minute or 60-minute durations. These are acute exposures. They don't tell you anything about long-term exposure. And they're only a single endpoint, this behavioral response to pressing a lever. This does not meet any reasonable standard for characterizing the potential of a hazardous agent.
That is how our limits were set. They are not set looking at biological effects that are non-heating related, long-term exposure, or from cumulative sources, or looking at children's vulnerability, or what the impacts might be to wildlife. They were set based on these small animal studies, and arbitrary safety factors were used to drop that level down, and that's how our US limits were set. It is unacceptable and indefensible. Now, our limits were set in 1996. In the year 2000, T-Mobile commissioned a report. The Ecolog Institute did it. It recommended an exposure level based on the science at that time, 1,000 times lower than FCC's current power density limit. 1,000 times lower. So when you hear that a cell tower is just 1% of the limit, well, the Ecolog Institute recommended 1,000 times lower. And now we have so much more science and research to support the knowledge that there are non-heating effects, because our limits are only based on overheating effects. I know some of you are coming here from other countries, so you're dealing with ICNIRP limits. But in the US, we have not had a scientific review of our limits since, actually not in 1996 either, but our limits were set in 1996 and have not been updated since then. So how did this happen? Well, there used to be a very active research program in the United States. Through the 70s and 80s, we had a robust EPA laboratories, staff who were measuring, monitoring, studying this issue, issuing reports on radiofrequency radiation. In fact, the EPA was tasked to develop safety limits, but was defunded. The Telecom Act passed in 1996, and at that time, the FCC adopted RF limits. Legal action was filed by several groups, and you'll probably hear about the Cellular Phone Task Force case against the FCC. And in it, the groups allege that these limits are not acceptable. And there's many people still working on the issue now who are in that case. The court did not have a favorable ruling for the petitioners. The key reason was they said that the FCC could reasonably expect agencies such as the EPA to keep abreast of scientific developments. And they talked about how the EPA had been on the verge of releasing its own draft guidelines. So at that time, the court thought and believed erroneously that the EPA was working on this issue, when in fact, at that time, there was very little activities left in the EPA related to researching the health effects of wireless radiation. This is in my paper in Frontiers on Public Health, because I think it's so important to note. So when the EPA was, just as it was poised to release safety standards, a safety standard means that agencies have looked at the issue, they have developed it based on science, but we never did. This is a briefing that they did to the FCC about it, where they talk about their strategy. Phase 1 is going to be interim exposure guidelines, where they're going to look at known effects. Then they're going to also look at modulation, pulsation, the complexity of the wave, and come up with some final exposure guidelines. This was fully defunded. The EPA never developed safety limits for wireless radiation or for non-ionizing radiation. This is the last review that was published on radio frequency radiation. It's from 1984, The Biological Effects of Radio Frequency Radiation. And I talk about this in my paper and document it. So if you want to go to the sources, or you can do that in the paper in Frontiers that I published in December. So we have a regulatory gap. There's no review of the totality of evidence by any U.S. federal agency in the near recent times. No risk or hazard assessment, no science-based evaluation of FCC limits. Are they appropriate? Normally, you would take the level at which credible research that you've evaluated has shown harm based on a process, and you would compare it to FCC limits and ask, are these limits acceptable? That has not been done. There is, in fact, a near absence of EMF non-ionizing radiation activities by all U.S. regulatory agencies with health, safety, or environment expertise. Now, in our case against the FCC, I guess I should take a step back. So in 2019, the FCC said, after 7 years of an open inquiry when information was submitted to the record, they made the decision that they didn't need to change their limits. And both myself, at the time I was executive director of Environmental Health Trust, and other petitioners then took legal action against the FCC with 10,000 plus pages of evidence. And in 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit ruled in our case that the FCC's decision not to update its 1996 wireless radiation limits was arbitrary and capricious. And the court found that the FCC had not provided evidence of properly reviewing the record evidence related to non-cancer impacts. That would be like impacts to the brain, reproductive system, immune system, long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, how our compliance test procedures are relevant, and that there had been a complete failure to address environmental effects. The court ordered the FCC to explain how its limits were protective for the issues it had ignored. The FCC has not responded. So people ask, well, what does that mean? It means that our limits are not defensible at this time, that the FCC has not shown that it has properly evaluated all of the research on its record. It has not explained how its limits are adequately protective. And what I would say is, if the limits are so safe, and if the FCC did such a stellar job in looking at this issue, where is its homework? Where is the explanation? Why couldn't they just come out explaining how our limits were protective? Now, in that case, in the decision of the DC Circuit, they note the silence of our expert agencies, saying, because the FCC said, well, no one told us that there was a problem, as if that means that this exposure is safe. And the judges said, the majority said, the silence of other expert agencies, however, does not constitute a reasoned explanation for the Commission's decision to terminate its notice of inquiry for the same reason that the FDA's conclusory statements do not constitute a reasoned explanation. So here we are in 2026, and we're facing the fast tracking of cell towers, and yet we have the 1996 Telecommunications Act that says no state or local governments may regulate wireless facilities on the basis of the environmental effects so long as the facilities comply with FCC regulations. So local officials are often warned that they could be sued if they stop the placement of cell towers due to concerns about health or environmental impacts. I have been stopped from speaking in meetings if I start to talk about health. They say, oh, I can't hear that. or one woman had a whistle blown at her. How does this make sense?
I heard some people saying that we cannot protect ourselves from 5G on health reasons. Now, I don't know where in the corporate infrastructure somebody was paid to say you're not allowed to protect yourself in the name of health. My God, that's some crazy stuff, isn't it?
This is federal preemption. It comes up over and over again. But how can environmental or health effects, so under environmental effects, health effects is considered an environmental effect. How can it be disallowed in cell tower siting decisions when our government has not done any science-based review for decades? And we have limits that are sky high. This is pretzel logic, as coined by Blake Levitt. I talk about this in my papers in Frontiers. We have a complete, utter lack of oversight related to this issue. We have no measuring and monitoring program to know, well, what are the levels that I'm experiencing? Someone just asked on a listserv where there's a situation with a cell tower. Well, has anyone gone around and measured? Well, we don't have a measuring and monitoring program. That was defunded. There used to be field offices that the EPA and FCC staff would be measuring. We don't do that anymore. There's no oversight program to ensure cell tower emissions are compliant post-deployment. No required yearly checks or audits for cell towers. I'm talking about at the federal level. No national publicly accessible database of all cell tower and wireless sites. I mean, if you want to know if there is a cell tower near you or proposed near you, it's a whole job. And I know many of you on this call know that. It is a lot of work. It should not be this hard. That information should all be transparently presented by the federal government as well as local governments. And there's really a way to do that because many countries have done that. There's no excuse for the US not to be doing that. There's also no pre-market safety testing before deployment of new technologies, no post-market surveillance of health or environmental impacts, and no medical or health reporting mechanisms. So if a doctor documents an impact, as they do often, they don't have a place to submit that. Like with a drug, you can report side effects. We don't have that for radiofrequency wireless radiation. And there's no robust occupational health program. Actually, there's a lot more issues, but that's sort of my cliff notes. Now, many countries have a way that you can go online in a publicly accessible website, see where base stations are, type in an address, and find what's near you, find what the levels are, and so forth. This is showing, and you can actually go in and out. This is a map of Switzerland, where you can see base station antennas. This is the French website where you can go in and type your address and see what the measurements are locally near you. Greece has 500 fixed stations and several mobile stations where they go around measuring. All of that information is presented. Now, I do need to tell you that there are many issues with many of the way countries are measuring and monitoring, but at least they are doing something. It is 1,000 times more than the United States, where we don't have any of this. And there are actually publications on issues related to each country's, the way they're doing it, how they might be averaging, which is, of course, they're averaging, really big issue. But here in the United States, when I've done FOIAs, I have not gotten a lot of information. Like in New York City, they won't give me the RF reports. Many people have reported that to us. When a former engineering consultant went on rooftops across the country, there's a Wall Street Journal article where they found 10% of the rooftops that were visited were out of compliance. And this can be not just the RF radiation, but making sure that people aren't able to go in areas that are exceeding FCC limits. So there are a lot of regulatory issues that require compliance. There isn't anyone checking, actually. So this engineering consultant filed 100 congressional complaints with the EMR Policy Institute, and no enforcement actions were taken. Now, when I at EHT requested RF compliance reports from both New York City as well as the FCC, I was denied. And in one case, because Verizon objected. So I just put the letter here where Verizon said they object to the release of the total number of rooftop antenna locations owned by Verizon, and that would be provided in the compliance reports. So it's confidential and needed to be treated as non-public. Just recently here in Montgomery County, I was told by a wireless company, who I'm not going to name right now, that the information was proprietary, confidential, unacceptable in my book. And the Swiss government has a map where you can actually see what the wireless radiation levels are estimated. Again, there are issues with all of these types of platforms and how they measure and such, but at least they have something for the community. And here they have, it's color-coded by the levels of measurements. And this is the Swiss Basel government. Whereas our last measurement report was from 1986, the EPA's last measurement report. That's the cover of it. Again, go to my paper, U.S. Policy on Wireless Technologies and Public Health Protection, Regulatory Gaps and Proposed Reforms, published in Frontiers in Public Health, to learn more about the regulatory issues. I did a very broad overview in the paper. Wish I could do more, but I had to cut 2,000 words. So how did we get here? Well, we're in a situation where the industry influence runs deep. Wireless companies heavily lobby policymakers, shaping laws and regulations to serve their interests, to fast-track cell towers and streamline the ability to get their products and their equipment built, their equipment set up as fast as possible. It's led to a classic case of regulatory capture. This report in 2015 by the Harvard Edmund Safra Center for Ethics compared the tactics of the wireless industry to big tobacco. They talk about how the wireless industry is using the same playbook to create doubt regarding health effects, that there's heavy lobbying resulting in industry-friendly regulation and regulatory capture, with the FCC exemplifying the revolving door between industry and government, where you have a FCC commissioner who leaves and then goes on to become the head or in a prime position in the wireless industry lobby. We have that now with Ajit Pai. We had it with Tom Wheeler. Brendan Carr, current FCC chair, used to be working for a law firm representing the wireless industry. In fact, he was participated in legal action against the city of San Francisco related to the Cell Phone Right to Know Act. So companies also warn shareholders, but not us. What you're seeing here is another smokestack cell antenna facility with a playground, and this is actually a school. The companies warn their shareholders. They say in their annual reports and their 10K reports that the financial health of the company could be impacted by changes related to RF radiation. So I'll quote Crown Castle. If radio frequency emissions from wireless handsets or equipment on our communications infrastructure are demonstrated to cause negative health effects, potential future claims could adversely affect our operations, costs, or revenues. We currently do not maintain any significant insurance with respect to these matters. They don't have insurance because the insurance companies consider RF radiation high risk.
As the fight continues to prevent a new 5G cell phone tower from becoming operational as it stands feet away from this Wyandotte school, a professor from Wayne State University is speaking out.
Whoever planned to put this cellular tower so close to the students and the teachers is wrong.
Professor John Liu has a background in electrical and computer engineering.
Yeah, I invented the modem for DirecTV. Back then we called it Spaceway. That was the project we started at Hughes Electronics in 1998.
The professor makes it clear this type of technology does not belong that close to the human body.
This is pure evil. Yeah, it just read my lips. This is pure evil. Each sector is transmitting 40 watts continuously. They're facing high risk of brain tumor.
But despite what this academics research provides, the school district has allowed the tower on the grounds of George Washington Elementary School. The tower is also near a playground. The school district entered into an agreement with T-Mobile and will get paid monthly, but parents say they want it removed before it becomes operational.
We, as a school,
we as a school, no, not we as a school, we as parents.
A recent informational meeting was cut short by the district after parents expressed frustration.
This is a Swiss Re Institute report called Sonar, New and Emerging Risk Insights, and they talk about 5G as an off-the-leash risk. It's labeled as high impact because the impacts can have a long latency, much like asbestos, which many insurance authorities have compared wireless radiation to. There was a Lloyd's of London report in 2010 that said the danger with EMF is that, like asbestos, the exposure insurers face is underestimated and could grow exponentially and be with us for many years. And that image is from a business insurance white paper. Insurance companies exclude damage from EMFs as industry standard in their general policies. This is clips from Genesis Insurance, a major provider of liability coverage for educational institutions, K through 12, universities, school boards. And they state that their insurance does not apply to RF radiation or bodily injury from, or directly or indirectly from, electromagnetic radiation. Even the wireless industry itself classifies RF radiation as a form of pollution. This is Verizon's Total Mobile Protection Plan. They define pollutants to include any solid, liquid, gas, or thermal irritant or contaminant, including, they list a couple, and they have artificially produced electric fields, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, and all artificially produced ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Similar language appears in the cell phone protection plans from AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, and T-Mobile. So companies have been informed in published papers to mitigate their liability and risk by having distances between the towers and people. In 2020, this article by a professor from Michigan Technological University published a review on the science and concluded that there was adequate medical and scientific evidence to warrant long-term liability concerns for companies deploying cell phone towers. And that in order to protect the cell phone tower firms, it concludes that you can restrict the cell antennas from being close to schools and homes. And we have a bunch of fact sheets, but on the issue of insurance, risk, and liability, we have the different companies. I keep that updated. We have the 2024 right now statements, and you can go online at EH Sciences to download that. Everything is hyperlinked on our website. We also have pages on cell towers showing the RF limits and fact sheets that have what other countries are doing. So, for example, there are many countries that restrict cell towers near schools: Russia, Turkey, Greece, Bangladesh, Israel, Chile, regions in Australia. And we have links to that. We have information on that for you to know. In addition, in the United States, there are communities like Williamson County in Tennessee that has a setback for schools. There are school districts in the United States, like Los Angeles, Palo Alto, Westland, Wilsonville, Temecula Valley Unified, Loudoun County, which more recently, that is considered the wealthiest county in the country, where they have banned new cell towers on school property. Now, all of these are at risk with the new federal rules that could come down if proposals are confirmed by the FCC. This may change. There are also communities that have ordinances with setbacks. And it's important to note that in those setbacks, some of them have safety valves so that they're not going to prohibit service. So if service is prohibited, there can be a change to those setbacks. The International Association of Firefighters, since 2004, has opposed cell towers on their stations.
Hello, Lewis Courier, LA County Fire Captain, 29 years. I'm speaking today against these cell towers that are being installed at our fire stations for the health and safety of the residents and the firefighters who live there. The problem we have in this country today is an absence of adequate recommendation standards, and as a consequence, the corresponding standards that are being used are not applicable to the world we live in today. The FCC safety benchmarks that LA-RICS is using are antiquated and industry controlled. We've all seen in the past how well industry controlled standards has worked in other industries, and the examples given today, such as tobacco, chemical, fire retardants, etc. This is a classic case of the fox watching the hen house. We have reviewed over 4,000 studies done by medical professionals that are peer-reviewed that show that there are adverse health effects at levels much less than what the LA-RICS people are saying. Firefighters are already exposed to a lot of RF radiation, EMFs, and chemicals exposure, so much so that cancer is presumptive for us. When will enough be enough? When will we hit our hypersensitivity level? I'm hoping we don't find out. Please stop these cell towers at our fire stations. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. Let me also...
Firefighters living and working beneath cell towers like this one have gotten sick. Headaches, extreme fatigue, memory loss, and brain scans show that firefighters exposed to toxic RF radiation experience cell death, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has approved cell tower installations on fire stations in neighborhoods like yours. Call Supervisor Don Canavi and tell him to stop the cell towers now.
The New Hampshire Commission, if you're not familiar with that, and I designed this talk, which I know is getting long, but I wanted to get everything in here for you. If you are new to this issue, the New Hampshire Commission report is a report you need to read and learn about, because they did a year of investigation and they found that there was scientific evidence of harmful effects at levels below government limits. And they came out with 15 recommendations after interviews with many experts on this issue, on how to reduce exposure to the public and protect the state, protect the public, and the environment. One of the recommendations is a 1,600-foot setback for cell towers from schools and homes. The Los Angeles, California Public School District, they have banned cell towers on schools. They have said they have a threshold 10,000 times lower than FCC limits. Now, they say that. There are a lot of issues, however, with how that is actually working out in truth. They do have bans on cell towers on school property. The Santa Clara County Medical Association, please make sure you have a copy of their best practices for schools, as well as the Santa Clara County Medical Association bulletin that comes out, where Dr. Cindy Russell, who is also the Physicians for Safe Technology Executive Director, has many reports and really easy to understand and share articles on the issue of cell tower and wireless radiation. But the best practices for schools that was passed by the Santa Clara County Medical Association says that exposure should be reduced. And they asked school districts to consider a policy to restrict installation of cell towers on school property to at least 1,640 feet between a cell tower and a school. Please sign up for our newsletter at ehsciences.org. We have a wireless and EMF program newsletter, as well as other newsletters on environmental health. So if you're interested in plastics or chemicals, pesticides, EHS is tracking what is going on in terms of the science as well as the latest news on the issue. So thank you all for being interested, educating, advocating, spread the word on this issue. It is so important that we all work together, and that is how we are going to fix this. Again, my contact information is Theodora at ehsciences.org. You can contact me for more. Thank you so much.